really want to get to this video by Dan McClellan, and it is on who killed Goliath. So just to give you a little bit of background, this is his favorite contradiction. This is in response to McClellan 2947. I do want to commend Dan. He makes so many videos. He's got his own little hashtag and the number as a reference marker for which video. So props to you, Dan. That's a good method here. So McClellan 2947. I'm starting around the 430 mark, 426, because he's responding to a scholar, and I wanted to engage with what was just about this blog post, because I've got some comments I want to make in reply to Dan over what he was stating about this issue. So he'll set up the issue for us. There's a discrepancy in the Old Testament over who killed Goliath. So let's listen in. I'll pause. I'll make my own comments here and there, and we'll work through this together as we have a longer live stream today than usual.
Peter Gurry got on Twitter, and he also challenged me. And here's what he said, where he's kind of engaging with a video of my own. And he points to not an academic article, but like a blog post that Ozelins published. And I went to that blog post expecting to find the same claim, but I found two entirely different reasons to think that achi is more original than et. The first one having to do with the fact that when there seems to be an alteration that is...
Okay, so let me give you the references here. So we've got 1 Samuel 17:50. It talks about David cutting off Goliath's head. 2 Samuel 29:11 in the Hebrew Masoretic text states that Elhanan, I'm going to mess up these Hebrew names, the son of Yahar Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath, the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. As this verse stands in the Masoretic text, it certainly contradicts 1 Samuel 17. But fortunately, we have a parallel passage in 1 Chronicles 25. I'm reading here from Gleason Archer's Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, so the way he's describing this. So the words in 1 Chronicles 25, and Elhanan the son of Jair slew Rachmi, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. It is quite apparent that this was the true reading, Archer argues, not only for the Chronicles passage, but also for 2 Samuel 21:19. We'll get into his reasoning why after we engage with McClellan, but that gives you a little background here. I really like that Dan put this up here because he's provided the Hebrew for you. And I want to remark, this is something he observes, but he ultimately rejects, that on the screen here you can see the Hebrew, and you can see just how close these Hebrew words are. And it's extremely common. Dan will, again, rightly remark that scholars believe when something like this happens, that there was simply a scribal error in the copying. Because look at how close these Hebrew words are. This brother of, and this et. Look at that. You just have, I don't know, there's a technical term for these things, I'm sure, but look at how similar those are, and just those little tiny marks providing the difference between those different Hebrew words. I will say, I am not a textual critical scholar. I'm not an Old Testament scholar. I'm a theologian. But I will say, let's take the time to understand the arguments, because anybody can take the time to understand what a teacher is teaching. But then let's engage with what this teacher is teaching to see if it's, as I've said on other program episodes, teaching or screeching.
The result of the visual similarity of letters or words, that's usually accidental. And then the second one having to do with the fact that the contradiction didn't seem to bother anybody who edited the books of 1 and 2 Samuel. So why would we imagine it bothered the compiler of 1 Chronicles? And both of these considerations, although entirely distinct from the argument that was presented in the peer-reviewed academic article, these are also both incorrect. Because, yes, it is a text-critical principle that when there is a variant reading and the variation has something to do with the visual similarity of the words, that's usually accidental.
So he's already making an admission that this is what critical scholars believe, that when there is strong similarity between two different words and you've got a textual variant, it's likely an accident that has slipped in to the text
rather than intentional. However,
okay, he says however, so let's listen to his reasons here. Let's listen to his reasons, because he provided the Hebrew, And boy, do those look extremely similar.
If there is theological significance to the variation, that has to come into play. You can't just say, oh, visually similar, that means that it was accidental, case closed. If there is theological significance, that weighs into the decision, because that text critical principle is not a hard and fast rule. It's just a trend. It's what normally happens.
Okay, so I do not buy this. So Dan is arguing that there's theological significance here, and I just don't buy that this is a theologically significant example. What would it take for there to be a theologically significant example? Well, something like a difference in how Jesus is understood would be theologically significant. This is more of a historically significant issue. And I think maybe the way Dan's understanding this is that it's theologically significant because this creates a historical error. So for Dan, this is about inerrancy. But I don't think that's what these scholars mean when they talk about a theologically significant textual variant. They would mean that the text itself is making a theological distinction, a different issue. This is the implications of the variant, not the variant itself. So Dan's depending upon the implications. There's a theological significance for the implications, not for the issue at stake itself. So I do not agree with Dan on his however response. And I think that because these Hebrew words are so similar, that we can say it's a copyist error. But let's get more into it.
And so you have to consider other confounding variables. And here, obviously, there is theological significance to a change that resolves a flat contradiction of another biblical text. So the first consideration is certainly not determinative, and I don't think that weighty at all. But the second one is even more problematic, because the idea is that, well, if the contradiction didn't bother anybody who was responsible for editing 2 Samuel 21:19, why should we imagine it bothered anybody who was compiling 1 Chronicles? And there are a few reasons. One is that the books of Samuel and Kings were edited centuries earlier than the books of Chronicles, in a period when they didn't show as much concern for textual consistency, unity, harmony. And the editors of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel and the books of Kings were not all that concerned for that. There are a bunch of contradictions that are found internally within Samuel and Kings.
Let's get a couple of those, Dan.
In fact, even in the story of David's killing of Goliath, we have contradictions where David has to be introduced to Saul 2 different times. And
David has to be introduced to Saul 2 different times, therefore that's a contradiction? That doesn't seem to follow. That's a non sequitur. There have been times, for example, when I've met a famous person on 2 different occasions, and I reintroduced myself to them in the hopes that it might jog their memory. So in this regard, I've been introduced to people, to the same person, twice. That doesn't mean that there's a contradiction. As a simple matter of logic, Dan's claim here is incorrect. It is a non sequitur. It is false that being introduced to someone 2 times does not mean there is a contradiction.
Scholars are in pretty widespread agreement that this is because the story is preserving 2 variant versions of Saul's introduction to David. So the editing of Samuel and Kings is earlier, is not as concerned with consistency, and already preserves multiple internal contradictions. So that's not really a good argument. And additionally, the books of Chronicles were far more carefully compiled and edited, and the editors had a proclivity towards altering what they found in the books of Samuel and Kings. So it's a much more unified, much more consistent editorial process, and it is altering a lot more commonly what is found in Samuel and Kings. So when we look at...
So I'm happy to agree with Dan's point there about Chronicles. Gleason Archer's proposal is that the passage in Chronicles is the original, and that the 2 Samuel 21 is the corruption. So we'll get into explaining that why, but Dan's remarks there about the chroniclers being far more careful. They were writing a chronicle, a rigid history over these events. So that is fully compatible with the solution Gleason Archer proposes. But Dan's solution is quite different.
the tendencies of the editors of Samuel Kings and of Chronicles. What's more likely? That the editor of Chronicles altered this to get rid of a contradiction. And there are more reasons to think that, because...
So Dan's proposal here is that the 2 Samuel passage is the original, and that the chronicler has edited and manipulated the text to get this contradiction out. Archer's proposal is the reverse. So we'll get into this a little bit.
Ozelin's argument, whichever one you pick, the peer-reviewed published version or the two identical versions we find in a couple of blog posts, ignores the fact that et, the direct object marker, the reading that would contradict 1 Samuel 17, is necessary for the text to work grammatically, because the verb comes first. We have this verb nacha, which means to smite or to kill, and then you have the subject that follows after, and this is Elchanan, and then it describes who Elchanan is. And then you have the direct object. And in order for that direct object to be identified as the direct object, you need the et. I looked using accordance through all...
You need the et. And Gleason Archer's proposal accommodates that need.
The occurrences in the entire Hebrew Bible of the verbal root nacha being used in a clause to refer to one person killing another person, where the object is mentioned either with an object suffix or explicitly mentioning the object. And there are only a couple of different ways it occurs. Either the direct object marker et is there, or if it is an object suffix, a pronominal suffix attached directly to the verb, you can have that, or you have the inseparable prefix bet attached to the object. I can find no occurrence anywhere in the Hebrew Bible of X, nacha, smote, killed, with the sense of killed, Y, where Y is not carrying either the direct object marker et or the inseparable prefix bet. So the author of 2 Samuel 21:19 would have had to have written et in order for the text to be fully understood.
Yes, that's correct, but Dan's imagination doesn't allow him to see how that could have occurred. So I'm going to share with you how that could have occurred in a minute here.
Otherwise, the text actually sounds like Elchanan, the son of so-and-so, the Bethlehemite, the brother of Goliath. It sounds like it's still describing who Elchanan...
Yeah, so Dan's right there that that's how the grammar works. But again, Dan's imagination doesn't allow him to understand how that could have been the case. So let's turn to this Ozelin's blog article at texancanon.org. And I'm bringing this up. You're welcome to check this out. And Ozelin's has ultimately a different solution than Archer. But I want to put this up here so you can see the Hebrew. You can see here the two verses in question, okay? You can see how they're similar and how they're different. Now, what is Gleason Archer's proposal in his Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties? His proposal is that 1 Chronicles 25 is the original. And here's how. He believes that there is a copyist dealing with a bad manuscript, and the copyist had to supply text that wasn't clear to him. Notice here some commonalities. Play along with me in this hypothetical, and I ask that you do so because it will assuage Dan's concern about the necessity of et. You have here Lachmi, which is also in the Hebrew of 2 Samuel 21. It's right there. But there's some other text that found its way in. And so what happened was the copyist read with this bad manuscript. The copyist had et and saw Lachmi and thought this was Bethlehemite. And so supplied these extra markings, extra letters, and then it changes the meaning of the sentence. So let me run through Gleason Archer's proposal here. I'm going to go back to my document camera, and this is on page 179 of Gleason Archer's Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, Zondervan. This is an older edition, I'm sure. But here it is. So here's how Archer proposes the solution. The sign of the direct object. Again, this was Dan's big issue against those that think there's no contradiction, because we have to make sense of this. There has to be the direct object, and et has to be there. Well, guess what? Gleason Archer accommodates it. First, the sign of the direct object, which in Chronicles comes just before Lachmi, was et. The copyist, that is, of 2 Samuel, mistook it for be'et, and thus got be'et hal-Lakmi, the Bethlehemite, out of it. That's the first step. So I just explained that to you when we were looking at the blog post, and there it is, point 1, Archer's description. Point 2, next step, he misread the word for brother as the sign of the direct object, right before Goliath. Thus, he made Goliath the object of killed instead of the brother of Goliath, as the Chronicles passage does. That's the second step. The third step, the copyist misplaced the word for weavers so as to put it right after Elhanan as his patronymic, the son of the forest of weavers, a most unlikely name for anyone's father. In Chronicles, the weavers comes right after Abimov, thus making perfectly good sense. So, for our purposes, it is plausible and coherent what Archer has proposed here. Now, do we have any rough, hard evidence, manuscript evidence of the textual variant occurring in this way? No, we don't. But what Dan required of his dissenters is to understand how et is used upon a direct object. And Archer's proposal does precisely that. It does explain it, it makes it coherent, and thus, I think, deflates the concern altogether. That this is simply as Archer writes. Here, you can see at the bottom of my screen here. In other words, the 2 Samuel 21 passage is a perfectly traceable corruption of the original wording, which fortunately has been correctly preserved in 1 Chronicles 25. I do not see a contradiction, and the copyist error is coherently explained that accommodates the proper rules of grammar that Dan correctly and rightly describes to us. I think that's a good enough solution, and I think you should think that as well, that there's not, in fact, in the original text, a contradiction. That works for me. If it doesn't work for you, I would be interested to hear why, because as we were listening to Dan, he described why it didn't work for him, but we assuaged his concerns. We came up with a proposal that worked for him. So I think that works for who killed Goliath. It was David who killed Goliath, and Elhanan killed the brother of Goliath. The issue has been resolved, I think.